Welcome to Sleepy Construction. Close your eyes and let's build. Tonight, we are going back past your grandparents, back past every war you've read about in school, back past the Roman Empire, past the pyramids of Mexico, past the very idea of most of the countries on a map today. We are going back 4,500 years to a wide golden stretch of desert on the west bank of the Nile River, just outside a city that didn't yet have the name we call it by now. There, under a sky so clear it seemed close enough to touch, a project began that would outlast every person who dreamed it up. Tonight, we build the Great Pyramid of Giza, slowly, stone by stone, just the way they did. You don't need to remember any of this. You don't need to follow every detail. You can simply let the story carry you, the way the river once carried stone. So, settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. If you'd like to keep building with us, night after night, a like and a subscribe helps this channel grow. And if there's a structure you've always wondered about, tell me in the comments. We may just build it together next. Before there was a pyramid, there was simply land. Flat, pale limestone bedrock, baked by a sun that rarely hid behind clouds. A gentle plateau, raised just enough above the floodplain of the Nile to stay dry when the river swelled each year. This was the Giza Plateau. For centuries, it had been quiet. Wind moved over it, slowly, the way wind moves over any wide open thing that has nowhere urgent to be. Small animals crossed it in the cool hours before dawn. Nothing marked it as special except that it was solid. Bedrock close enough to the surface to hold enormous weight without shifting or settling over time. That detail, the simple firmness of the ground, would end up mattering more than almost anything else in this story. You might not think of firm ground as an exciting detail. It isn't, really. But that's rather the point of tonight's story. Almost nothing about building a pyramid was exciting, in the way we usually mean that word. It was careful. It was repetitive. It was patient. In a way that very few things in modern life are asked to be patient anymore. And patience, as it turns out, is exactly what raises 480 feet of solid stone into the sky. Around 2560 BCE, give or take a few years depending on which calculation you trust, a pharaoh named Khufu inherited the throne of Egypt. Khufu was the son of Sneferu, a pharaoh who himself had been almost obsessively devoted to pyramid building. Sneferu tried and failed and tried again. His first attempt, built at a site called Midum, seems to have suffered structural problems. Some historians believe its outer casing eventually collapsed, leaving behind the strange, tower-like ruin that still rises out of the desert today. His second attempt, at Darsha, ran into trouble partway through construction. Cracks began appearing in the internal chambers. Rather than abandon the project entirely, his architects made a striking decision. They changed the angle of the pyramid partway up, reducing the steepness of the remaining structure to lessen the strain. The result is a pyramid that still stands today with two distinct slopes, steep near the base, gentler near the top, earning it the modern nickname, the Bent Pyramid. It is, in its own quiet way, one of the most honest buildings in the world. It doesn't hide its mistake. It simply adjusted and kept going and survived anyway. Sneferu's third attempt, built nearby at the same site, wisely succeeded. A smooth-sided, symmetrical structure, tinted faintly red by the iron content in its stone, still known today as the Red Pyramid. So when Khufu came to power, He didn't start from nothing. He inherited decades of trial, error, and hard-won knowledge. He inherited quarrying techniques, refined through failure. He inherited surveying techniques, tested against real, physical consequences. He inherited the beginnings of a labor system capable of moving thousands of people through a single, coordinated purpose, season after season, for years at a time. What Khufu decided to do with all of that inherited knowledge was simple to describe and almost impossibly difficult to do. He decided to build the largest, most precise pyramid ever attempted, and astonishingly, he succeeded. Let that settle for a moment. The structure we are about to build together in this story tonight still stands. It has stood through 4,500 years of sandstorms, earthquakes, empires rising and falling, and the slow, wearing hand of time. It is, even now, one of the largest structures ever built by human hands. And for nearly 4,000 years, it was simply the largest, full stop, with nothing else on the planet coming close. So how do you begin something like that? You begin, as with anything enormous, by breaking it into smaller pieces. A single stone, a single measurement, a single day of work, repeated until it becomes 20 years. Long before a single stone was placed, there was measurement. Egyptian architects, and we do know some of their names, which is remarkable in itself, considering how much else from this era has been lost, needed the base of the pyramid to be almost perfectly square and almost perfectly aligned with true north. Almost perfectly. In fact, the base of the Great Pyramid is accurate to within a fraction of a degree of true north, an achievement that still puzzles engineers today, especially considering the simplicity of the tools available to achieve it. No compasses, no satellites, no modern surveying equipment of any kind. What they had instead was patience and the sky. One likely method involved watching the stars. A surveyor would select a bright, easily identifiable star near the horizon and mark its position as it rose in the evening sky. Later that same night, the surveyor would return to mark the star's position again, this time as it dipped down and set on the opposite horizon. By finding the exact midpoint between those two marked positions, a surveyor could determine true north with striking accuracy. No instruments required, only careful, repeated observation across many quiet nights. Night after night, mark, wait, mark again. Find the midpoint. This is slow work, quiet work. Work done mostly in darkness, under stars that hadn't yet been given most of the names we use for them today. The kind of work that rewards patience over cleverness. There's something worth noticing in this method, if you let yourself sit with it a moment. The Egyptians didn't force precision. They didn't rush toward an answer. They simply watched, carefully, long enough, until the answer revealed itself on its own. Once north was established, the builders could lay out a square base with right angles, using simple tools. Measuring cords made of knotted rope, wooden set squares, and plumb lines. A small weight hung from a length of string used to check that something was perfectly vertical. The cords were especially important. A rope with knots tied at exact, equal intervals could be stretched across the ground and used almost like a giant, flexible ruler. By arranging the rope into specific configurations, for instance, a rope divided into 12 equal sections formed into a triangle with sides measuring 3, 4, and 5 sections, builders could reliably produce a perfect right angle every single time without fail. 3, 4, 5. It sounds almost too simple to have built one of the great wonders of the world. But mathematics doesn't need to be complicated to be powerful. It only needs to be applied with enough patience over and over until the result is exact. The surveyors would have worked in teams, likely under the direction of senior priests or scholars trained in what the Egyptians called the stretching of the cord, a ceremonial phrase used to describe the founding of any major building, sacred or otherwise. It's a lovely phrase when you think about it. The stretching of the cord. The very first act of creation, before a single stone existed, was simply pulling a rope taut across empty ground. And so, slowly, cord by cord, angle by angle, night by patient night, the outline of the base was marked into the pale limestone bedrock, a square, more than 750 feet on each side, wide enough that later engineers, using tools we now consider modern, laser measurement, satellite positioning, would take nearly a century to determine that ancient surveyors had achieved an internal accuracy of only a few centimeters across that entire distance. A few centimeters across 750 feet, using rope, wood, and stars. Let that sit with you quietly for a moment. There is a kind of calm in that number if you let it settle. Not showy precision, not rushed precision, just the quiet, accumulated result of care, applied consistently for as long as it took. With the base marked, the next question was simple to ask and enormous to answer. Where does 2.3 million blocks of stone come from? Because that is roughly the number of blocks the Great Pyramid required. Estimates vary, but most historians settle somewhere between 2 million and 2.3 million individual stone blocks, each weighing on average between 2.5 and 15 tons. Some blocks, used for special chambers deep inside the structure, weighed far more. Certain granite blocks are estimated at 25 to 80 tons each, heavier than a fully loaded truck today. Fortunately, the builders didn't need to look far for most of their material. Much of the pyramid's core was built from a soft, workable limestone that could be quarried directly from the Giza Plateau itself, in some cases from pits located just a short distance from the construction site. You can still see these quarry pits today, sitting quietly beside the pyramid, their edges rounded slightly by thousands of years of wind and shifting sand. Workers used copper chisels, wooden mallets, and dolerite pounding stones, a hard, dense volcanic rock, to cut into the natural limestone bed. Copper is a relatively soft metal, softer than the limestone it was cutting, which meant tools wore down constantly and needed frequent sharpening and replacement. Blacksmiths, working just outside the quarry, spent entire days doing nothing but repairing and resharpening chisels over and over, all day, every day for years. A slow, endless rhythm: cut, dull, sharpen, cut again. There is something oddly soothing in imagining that rhythm now. No urgency to it, no single sharpening more important than the one before or after. Just the same small task, repeated calmly, thousands of times, because the larger project needed it to continue. To separate a block from the bedrock, workers would first carve a narrow groove around its intended outline, cutting down gradually, inch by inch, using pounding stones to wear away the rock along the marked line. Once the groove was deep enough, workers would drive wooden wedges into the grooved regular intervals. Water would then be poured over the wedges, saturating the wood. As the wood slowly absorbed the water and expanded, the pressure would gradually, gently crack the stone along the clean, prepared line. Slowly, not violently. A patient pressure applied and then simply left alone to work on its own overnight if necessary, while the workers rested or moved to other tasks. By morning, the block would often be free, or very nearly free, ready to be levered the rest of the way loose. Once separated, the block would be roughly shaped on site, smoothed just enough to move efficiently, with finer polishing saved for later, once it reached its final resting place within the structure. But not all the stone came from Giza, the pyramid's outer casing. The smooth, brilliant white layer that once covered the entire structure, making it shine in the sun like a beacon visible for miles across the desert, came from a quarry across the Nile at a place called Tura. Tura limestone was finer grained, whiter, and considerably more beautiful than the coarser local stone used for the pyramid's core. It was reserved specifically for the outer surface, the part everyone, forever, would see first. And the massive granite blocks used for the king's chamber deep inside the pyramid, some weighing as much as a loaded truck today, came from Aswan, more than 500 miles to the south, near Egypt's border with what is now Sudan. 500 miles. Granite is far harder than limestone and required an entirely different quarrying approach. Workers used balls of an even harder stone called dolerite, pounding relentlessly against the granite surface to slowly wear grooves and eventually free blocks, a method requiring enormous patience, since granite yields far more reluctantly than limestone ever does. Some unfinished granite quarry sites near Aswan survive to this day, including one enormous obelisk, abandoned partway through cutting after a crack appeared in the stone, a rare glimpse of a project interrupted mid-thought, frozen in time for us to study thousands of years later. Which means, before we even discuss how these stones were lifted into place, we must discuss how they traveled such enormous distances in the first place. If you have ever tried to move something heavy, a piece of furniture, a large box, you already understand, on a small scale, the core problem the Egyptians faced. Except their furniture weighed as much as a small house, and they had to move millions of pieces of it, some across hundreds of miles of river and desert. The Nile River was their solution. During the flood season, when the river rose each year and spread wide across the land, boats could travel much closer to the quarry sites than during the rest of the year, when the water receded and left dry land in its place. Egyptian engineers understood this seasonal rhythm intimately and timed their heaviest transport work to match it, waiting patiently through the dry months for the water to rise again before moving their largest cargo. Massive wooden barges, some estimated to be capable of carrying loads of over 60 tons, were used to float the granite blocks from Aswan down the Nile, all the way north to Giza. These barges were built from imported cedar wood, since Egypt itself had relatively few large trees suitable for shipbuilding. Cedar was brought in from Lebanon along the eastern Mediterranean coast, through trade routes that connected Egypt to distant lands even in this early period. Loading a barge with a multi-ton granite block required its own careful choreography. Workers would likely build a temporary earthen ramp down to the water's edge, sliding the stone onto the waiting vessel using the same wooden sledges and wetted sand technique used elsewhere in the process. Once loaded, the journey downriver would begin. The journey would have taken weeks. Slow, steady, drifting progress downriver, the enormous stone cargo riding low in the water. workers managing ropes and steering oars as the current did most of the actual work of moving the weight. Picture it slowly if you can. A wide brown river under a bright sky. A heavy wooden barge riding low, almost silent except for the gentle sound of water against its hull. Workers resting in the shade of a woven canopy, taking turns at the steering oars, watching the riverbank slide past for days at a time. No rush, no urgency, just the current, doing what currents do, carrying something enormous toward its purpose. Once the stone reached the riverbank nearest the construction site, the truly difficult part began. Moving it from the water's edge, across the desert, to the base of the growing pyramid. For this, the Egyptians used wooden sledges, flat platforms without wheels, somewhat like a sled, onto which the stone blocks were secured using thick rope lashings. Wheels, as it turns out, are not especially useful in soft desert sand. They tend to sink and dig in rather than roll freely. A flat sledge, spreading weight over a wider surface area, works far better across loose, shifting ground. But even sledges need help. In 2014, physicists studying a wall painting inside an ancient Egyptian tomb noticed something curious. The painting depicted workers pouring water directly in front of a sledge as it was being pulled across the sand. For years, historians had assumed this detail was purely ceremonial or symbolic, a ritual gesture rather than a practical technique. Then, researchers at the University of Amsterdam decided to actually test it. They built small-scale models, pulling weighted sledges across trays of sand, carefully measuring the force required, with and without water added ahead of the sledge's path. They discovered that pouring the right amount of water onto sand ahead of a sledge can cut friction nearly in half. The water causes the sand grains to clump together into a firmer, more stable surface. Similar to how wet sand near an ocean's edge holds a footprint far better than the loose, dry sand found further up the beach. Nearly half the friction, simply from water, poured carefully at exactly the right moment just ahead of the load, which meant fewer workers were needed to pull each sledge than earlier estimates assumed. A discovery that quietly solves a puzzle historians had wondered about for a very long time. How a limited workforce managed to move so much stone so consistently for so many years without the enormous armies of laborers popular imagination once assumed were required. Teams of workers, sometimes numbering in the dozens for a single large block, would pull long ropes attached to the sledge, chanting in rhythm to keep their pulling synchronized. Pull, rest, pull, rest. A slow, coordinated breath, repeated for hours, moving one block a little closer to its final home. Overseers walked alongside the teams, occasionally directing a worker to pour more water just ahead of the runners, watching the sledge's progress across the sand, adjusting course gently as needed. There would have been dust in the air most days. The smell of wet sand drying quickly under a relentless sun. The steady, repeated sound of rope creaking under tension, and the low rhythmic chanting of dozens of voices moving together, slow, coordinated, patient. Let's slow down once more and follow a single granite block all the way from Aswan to Giza, from beginning to end. Picture it forming, first, deep within a quarry pit near Aswan, marked out carefully by a team of workers using dolerite pounding stones, wearing a narrow groove into the surrounding rock day after day, week after week, since granite yields far more slowly and reluctantly than the softer limestone found near Giza itself. After many weeks of steady, repetitive pounding, the block finally separates from the surrounding bedrock, roughly shaped, still rough at its edges, weighing perhaps 40 tons, as much as a large modern truck. Workers lever the block slowly onto a massive wooden sledge, reinforced specifically for this kind of weight, using thick rope lashings tied and checked repeatedly to ensure nothing shifts during the difficult journey ahead. A wide ramp of packed earth leads down from the quarry toward the riverbank, and here, once again, water is poured carefully ahead of the sledge's path, softening the ground just enough to ease its passage, while dozens of workers pull steadily on long ropes, chanting together to keep their combined effort synchronized. At the riverbank, an enormous wooden barge waits, built from imported cedar, its hull reinforced specifically to handle cargo of this scale. Loading the block onto the barge is in some ways the most delicate moment in this entire journey. Workers construct a temporary earthen platform, level with the barge's deck, allowing the sledge to be dragged directly onto the vessel without any sudden, dangerous drop that might crack the stone or damage the hull. Once secured, the barge waits for the right moment, likely during the Nile's annual flood season, when the water rises high enough to make the journey both safer and faster, floating closer to the fields and settlements that during drier months would sit well above the waterline. And then, slowly, the journey begins. The barge moves north, carried gently by the Nile's steady current, requiring only occasional steering rather than active propulsion. Workers on board take turns at long steering oars, while others rest beneath a woven canopy, sheltering from the sun during the long, unhurried days ahead. The riverbank slides past slowly, hour after hour, small farming villages, groves of date palms, other boats, smaller and lighter, carrying grain or pottery or simple everyday goods, sharing the same wide river. At night, the barge likely moors along the riverbank, the crew resting nearby, watching the same stars that Egyptian surveyors used to calculate true north. Though for these workers, tonight, the stars serve no purpose beyond simple, quiet company. Days pass this way. The granite block, so difficult to move even a short distance over land, drifts steadily northward, almost effortlessly now, carried by a current that asks nothing of the workers beyond patience. Eventually, after what may have been 2 or 3 weeks of steady travel, the barge approaches the riverbank nearest Giza, where a canal, specifically dug to connect the Nile to the construction site, allows the barge to travel the final stretch directly toward the pyramid itself. Unloading requires the same careful process as loading, in reverse. A temporary earthen platform, a slow, controlled transition from barge to sledge, ropes checked and rechecked before the final overland journey begins. From here, the block faces its last stretch, across open desert, up whichever ramp configuration the builders are currently using, and finally, after months of total travel time from a quarry hundreds of miles away, into its permanent position deep within the king's chamber, where it will remain undisturbed for the next 4,500 years. Multiply this single months-long journey by the many dozens of granite blocks required for the king's chamber and its surrounding relieving chambers, and you begin to appreciate the sheer logistical sophistication humming quietly behind this project. River transport, canal engineering, precise loading and unloading procedures, careful scheduling around the Nile's seasonal flooding. all coordinated across a workforce spread across hundreds of miles of Egyptian territory. None of it rushed, none of it improvised. Every stage planned, tested, and repeated with the same patient consistency we've seen throughout this entire story. For a long time, popular imagination pictured the pyramid builders as enslaved people, forced into the desert under the crack of a whip. The archaeological evidence tells a different, quieter story. In the 1990s, archaeologists led by Zahi Hawass and Mark Lehner discovered a substantial workers' village near the Giza Plateau. Bakeries, breweries, medical facilities, and cemeteries where the workers themselves were buried with genuine care and respect, an honor that would never have been extended to enslaved laborers in ancient Egyptian custom. These were not slaves. They were, most likely, a rotating labor force. Egyptian farmers who, during the months each year when the Nile's flood made farming impossible, worked on the pyramid instead, a kind of seasonal national service, paid in food, housing, and social status, rather than in currency, which barely existed in this period in the form we'd recognize today. Workers were organized into gangs, sometimes given playful, prideful names: Friends of Khufu, Drunkards of Menkaure, names painted directly onto some of the stone blocks themselves, discovered still legible thousands of years later, hidden on surfaces never meant to be seen once construction finished. Names like that don't belong to broken, hopeless people. They belong to workers with a genuine sense of identity, camaraderie, even humor about the exhausting work they were doing together. Each gang was divided into smaller teams, each responsible for specific, repeated tasks: quarrying, hauling, positioning, finishing, and each team likely competed in a friendly way with neighboring teams, keeping track of which group could complete its assigned stones fastest or with the cleanest cuts. Overseers coordinated the teams, reporting up through a chain of command that eventually reached the pyramid's chief architect. For Khufu's pyramid, a man named Hemunu, the pharaoh's own vizier and likely a close relative. Hemnu's statue survives today, showing a heavy-set, confident-looking man, clearly well-fed and comfortable in his authority. A rare, direct glimpse of the person who translated Khufu's ambition into an actual physical plan. Historians estimate the workforce at any given time numbered somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 people. A substantial, small city's worth of workers, fed daily by an enormous, continuous supply chain of bread, beer, and dried fish, brought in steadily from farms up and down the Nile. Bakeries near the workers' village have been excavated in extraordinary detail. Large clay vessels for baking bread in enormous batches, some capable of producing many thousands of loaves in a single day. Beer, too, was produced in enormous quantities, not primarily for entertainment, but as a genuine caloric staple, a safer alternative to drinking untreated water, and a welcome reward for hard physical labor endured in the desert heat. Archaeologists have found evidence of large-scale cattle butchery near the workers' village as well. Bones from thousands of animals, suggesting workers were fed meat regularly, a detail that further undermines the old image of starved, mistreated slaves. Medical evidence tells its own quiet story too. Skeletal remains found in the workers' cemetery show signs of healed fractures, broken bones that had been carefully set and allowed to mend, evidence of medical care provided to injured laborers rather than simple discarding of the injured. One skeleton belonging to a man who appears to have lost a leg, shows clear evidence that he survived the amputation and lived for a considerable time afterward, cared for by his community. Picture it if you can. Slowly, thousands of workers waking before dawn in a temporary city built specifically to support this single enormous task. The smell of fresh bread drifting across mud brick housing. Overseers gathering their teams in the cool, early light. The sun rising slowly over the eastern desert, casting long shadows across a pyramid that grew almost imperceptibly, a little taller each week, each month, each passing season. Children, likely playing somewhere nearby in the spaces between adult responsibilities. The low murmur of ordinary daily life, continuing quietly alongside an extraordinary project. It would have felt, at most days, less like the desperate suffering of legend, and more like something closer to purposeful, exhausting, communal work. Difficult, certainly, but shared and structured, and fed and respected. Now we come to the question that has fascinated and frustrated historians for centuries. Once a 2-ton, 5-ton, even 80-ton block reached the base of the pyramid, how did it get lifted? Sometimes hundreds of feet into the air, and placed with such precision that some joints between blocks are famously too tight to slide even a thin blade between them. There is no single, universally confirmed answer. But there are several well-supported theories, and it's worth walking through the most likely ones slowly. Most Egyptologists today believe the primary method involved massive earthen ramps. A ramp made of mud brick, rubble, and packed earth, built alongside the pyramid as it grew, allowing workers to drag stones up a gradual incline, used the same sledge and water technique used to move stone across the desert floor. As the pyramid grew taller, the ramp would need to grow taller and longer alongside it in order to maintain a manageable, walkable incline for teams dragging multi-ton loads. Several ramp designs have been proposed by different researchers over the decades, each attempting to solve the same underlying puzzle. One theory, favored for many years, suggests a single, long, straight ramp extending outward from one face of the pyramid, growing longer and longer as the structure rose, potentially stretching. By the time the pyramid neared completion, for nearly a mile across the desert floor, a ramp that long would itself have required an enormous volume of material to construct. Some estimates suggest the ramp alone might have needed almost as much material as the pyramid itself, which raises obvious practical concerns about efficiency. Another theory suggests a ramp that wrapped around the exterior of the pyramid in a rising spiral, hugging all four faces as it climbed, growing upward gradually alongside the entire structure simultaneously, rather than jutting outward in one straight line. This spiral approach would have used considerably less material than a single straight ramp, but presents its own challenges. Corners where the ramp would need to turn sharply, and difficulty verifying that upper sections remained perfectly aligned, since surveyors could no longer sight directly along the pyramid's edges once the ramp obscured them. A more recent theory, supported by evidence uncovered at a different, smaller pyramid site belonging to Sneferu, suggests an internal ramp, a corkscrewing pathway built into the body of the pyramid itself, spiraling upward through the interior near the outer edges, with a simpler external ramp used only for the lowest levels of construction. This internal ramp theory gained considerable support in 2018, when a French research team used a technique called muon tomography, essentially imaging the pyramid's interior using naturally occurring cosmic particles that pass through solid stone, and detected what appears to be a large, previously unknown void running through the pyramid's structure in a pattern consistent with an internal ramp. Each theory has genuine strengths. Each still has unanswered questions. The truth may well involve a combination of methods, adapted and adjusted as the project evolved across its 20-year timeline. Since there is no requirement that the builders used only one single technique from start to finish. Building projects, then as now, adapt. What worked at 40 feet of height might not have worked as well at 300 feet. And there is no reason the Egyptians wouldn't have adjusted their methods as new challenges appeared. What we do know with far more confidence is the mechanism of movement once a stone reached the ramp's surface. Wooden sledges, wetted sand, coordinate teams of workers, pulling in rhythm, chanting or singing to stay synchronized. A practice still used by manual laborers moving heavy loads in parts of the world today, because rhythm genuinely does make repeated, sustained pulling easier to coordinate and endure. Levers, too, played an important role. Long wooden poles, sometimes tipped with stone or metal fittings, used to pry and adjust a block's final position once it was close to its resting place, nudging it into precise alignment, fraction by fraction, worker by worker, until it settled exactly where the plan required. And here is where the story becomes, in its own way, almost meditative, because moving one stone, even a single modest 2.5-ton block, required cooperation. Dozens of people pulling together, resting together, adjusting together, communicating through shouted instructions and practiced rhythm rather than any written plan. Now multiply that single stone by 2 million. Every single day, for roughly 20 years, this same slow cooperative process repeated itself. Quarry, load, transport, haul up the ramp, adjust, set, move to the next stone. Over and over, season after season, year after year, slowly the pyramid grew. Not in dramatic leaps, but in the quiet accumulation of thousands upon thousands of individually unremarkable actions. Each one small, each one careful, each one contributing to something that would eventually rise higher than any structure built before it. There is a kind of comfort in that, if you think about it slowly enough. Nothing about this process happened quickly. Nothing about it happened without immense, sustained effort. And yet, stone by stone, day by day, it happened anyway, while the outer form of the pyramid rose steadily under the desert sun. An entirely separate, remarkably precise construction effort was happening since I eyed its growing mass. Deep within the pyramid's core, engineers built a series of passageways and chambers: the King's Chamber, the Queen's Chamber, and the Grand Gallery, a soaring, narrow corridor with a corbelled ceiling that rises nearly 30 feet above the floor, built using a technique where each layer of stone extends slightly inward past the layer below it, creating a strong, self-supporting, arch-like structure without relying on an actual keystone arch. Walking through the Grand Gallery today, visitors describe a strange sensation: a narrow, steeply rising passage, ceiling drawing gradually closer overhead with each successive course of stone, leading upward into darkness toward the King's Chamber beyond. It would have felt much the same to the workers who built it 4,500 years ago, carrying tools and materials up that same steep incline. day after day, by torchlight or the dim light filtering in from outside. The king's chamber, built from enormous granite blocks, transported all the way from Aswan, sits almost exactly at the pyramid's center, roughly 2/3 of the way up its total height. An unusual placement, since most earlier pyramids placed their burial chambers below ground level, carved directly into bedrock rather than suspended within the structure itself. This decision to build the chamber so high within the solid mass of the pyramid created an entirely new engineering problem. How do you prevent the sheer, crushing weight of millions of tons of stone above from collapsing the empty space below it? Above the king's chamber, engineers built a series of 5 separate relieving chambers, stacked one on top of another, each with a flat granite ceiling designed specifically to distribute the immense weight of the pyramid above, redirecting it outward toward the pyramid's solid corners, away from the king's chamber's open ceiling, protecting it from being crushed under the weight above. The topmost of these 5 chambers has a distinctly different ceiling. Instead of flat granite beams, it uses 2 enormous sloped stones meeting at a peak, forming a simple triangular roof that channels weight outward even more effectively than the flat chambers below it. This is an extraordinary piece of structural engineering, the kind of problem modern engineers still study with genuine admiration because the solution works precisely as intended. 4,500 years later, the king's chamber remains structurally intact, its ceiling uncracked, exactly as designed, even as a massive earthquake in the region during the 14th century damaged and toppled much of the pyramid's outer casing. The chamber that quietly held its shape, every passageway, every chamber needed to align precisely with the others, often across distances of hundreds of feet of solid stone, built simultaneously, with the exterior structure continuing to rise around it, layer by layer, with no opportunity to go back and easily correct a hidden error once it was buried beneath subsequent layers of stone. A single miscalculation, uncorrected, could have meant a passageway that missed its intended chamber entirely, sealed forever beneath solid stone, an error with no possible remedy. Once construction moved past that point, it didn't happen. Every measurement held, passage after passage, chamber after chamber, for the full 20 years it took to complete the structure. There is also, within the pyramid, a set of narrow shafts, sometimes called air shafts, though their true purpose remains debated, extending outward from both the king's chamber and queen's chamber toward the exterior of the pyramid at very specific angles. Some researchers believe these shafts were purely functional, providing ventilation during construction. Others believe they held deeper symbolic meaning, aligned deliberately with specific stars or constellations important to Egyptian religious beliefs about the afterlife. Pathways, perhaps, intended to guide the pharaoh's spirit toward particular points in the night sky. We may never know for certain which explanation is correct, or whether both are true simultaneously. Some mysteries, even after thousands of years of careful study, remain quietly unresolved. And there is something soothing in that too. Not every question needs an answer to still be worth sitting with, quietly in the dark. As the pyramid neared its final height, the builders faced a delicate final challenge. Each layer of stone became slightly smaller than the layer below it, gradually tapering the structure toward a single point at its peak, requiring increasingly precise calculations to ensure the four sloping faces would still meet perfectly at the very top, rather than arriving slightly askew after 480 feet of accumulated stone. The very top of the pyramid would have been finished with a capstone known as a pyramidion, likely made of granite, or possibly even gold-plated or gold-covered, designed to catch the very first and very last light of each day, reflecting it outward across the desert in a way visible for great distances. Sadly, no original capstone survives today, so we can't know its exact appearance with certainty. But ancient texts and smaller surviving pyramidions recovered from later pyramid sites suggest something brilliant, reflective, and deeply symbolic once sat at the very top of Khufu's monument. Once the core structure was complete, workers began the long, careful process of adding the outer casing stones, the polished white Tura limestone that would have originally covered the entire pyramid in a smooth, brilliant surface, hiding the rougher core stones entirely from view. This outer layer was most likely added from the top down, rather than the bottom up, working in the opposite direction from the main construction. Scaffolding, likely built from the same ramp system used during construction, allowed workers to carefully lower each casing stone into place, then polish it smooth against its neighbors, working downward, level by level, gradually removing sections of the ramp as they descended, and the ramp's material was no longer needed at the levels already finished. The precision required for this final layer was extraordinary. Some of the casing stones fit together so tightly that even today, examining the small surviving fragments near the pyramid's base, researchers cannot slide even a thin piece of paper into the seam between adjacent blocks. This near-perfect fit wasn't accidental. Each casing stone was individually shaped and fine-tuned on-site, tested against its neighbors, adjusted, tested again, until the joint satisfied the builder's exacting standard. Slow, repeated adjustment applied stone by stone across the entire visible surface of the largest building on Earth. When the Great Pyramid was completed, somewhere around 2540 BCE, it would have stood gleaming white in the desert sun, visible from extraordinary distances across the flat surrounding land, its smooth surface catching and reflecting light in a way that must have seemed almost impossibly beautiful to anyone approaching from the Nile. Ancient accounts, written centuries later by visitors from Greece and elsewhere, describe the pyramids as shining structures, radiant against the horizon. Descriptions that make far more sense once you picture the original, unweathered casing, rather than the rougher, sand-colored stone we recognize in modern photographs. Most of that original casing has since been removed over the centuries, taken by later builders during the medieval period to construct mosques, palaces, and city walls in nearby Cairo, repurposed for entirely new buildings that themselves still stand today, quietly carrying pieces of the pyramid within their own walls. What remains visible today? The rougher, more weathered stone we recognize in photographs is essentially the pyramid's underlying skeleton, its core structure, not its original finished skin. When the pyramid was finally finished, roughly 20 years after it began, it stood approximately 481 feet tall. The tallest human-made structure on Earth, a record it would hold for nearly 4,000 years, until the completion of Lincoln Cathedral in England in the year 1311. Nearly 4,000 years. Think for a moment, slowly, about how much changed across that stretch of time. Empires rose, expanded, and disappeared entirely. Languages were born, evolved, and eventually died out completely, forgotten by everyone who once spoke them. Entire religions rose to prominence and faded quietly into history. And still, patiently, the pyramid stood exactly where it had been placed, watching all of it happen from a distance, unmoved, unchanged in its essential shape, even as everything around it transformed again and again. The workers' village slowly emptied once the project concluded, its residents returning to their farms, their families, their ordinary lives, carrying with them the memory of the years they'd spent building something impossibly large alongside their neighbors. Some of those workers likely told the story to their children, who told it to their own children in turn, a story that would have slowly transformed generation after generation, from lived memory into legend, and eventually into the kind of half-remembered myth that led later visitors, centuries afterward, to assume such an achievement must have required slaves, or magic, or forces beyond ordinary human effort. It required none of those things. It required people, ordinary people, in extraordinary cooperation, sustained across 2 decades. The chief architect, Hemiunu, was eventually laid to rest in his own tomb near the pyramid itself, close enough that, if such things could be felt, he might still sense his life's work standing nearby, exactly as he designed it, uncracked, unmoved, precisely aligned. Khufu, the pharaoh whose ambition began this entire project, was laid to rest inside the very chamber his workers had built with such care, though his mummy and any treasures once placed alongside him were lost long ago to tomb robbers who breached the pyramid's defenses at some point in antiquity, leaving the king's chamber empty of everything except a single plain granite sarcophagus, too large to have been removed through the narrow passageways built to contain it. That sarcophagus remains there still, sitting quietly in an empty stone room, exactly where it was placed over 4,000 years ago, having outlasted its intended occupant by a margin of millennia. What remained, in the end, wasn't gold, or jewels, or even the pharaoh himself. What remained was the structure, 2.3 million blocks of stone, quarried by hand, floated down a river, dragged across a desert, lifted by ramps and rope and rhythm and water-dampened sand, set into place with a precision that still humbles engineers working with laser levels and satellite positioning today. Modern visitors, standing at the base and looking upward, often describe a strange, disorienting sense of scale. A building so large that the mind struggles at first to properly process it, the way we sometimes struggle to comprehend distances measured in light years, or spans of time measured in millennia. And yet it was built entirely by hand. No engines, no electricity, no modern machinery of any kind. Just 20,000 to 30,000 people, fed on bread and beer and dried fish, working in rotating seasonal shifts, guided by architects who had inherited generations of hard-won knowledge, applying patience and cooperation and careful measurement, one stone at a time, for 20 slow, steady years. The stone was set, the casing was polished, and the pyramid stood finished, gleaming white against the desert sky. But the story doesn't quite end there. There is a little more worth sitting with, slowly, before we finally rest. Before we move further into the story, let's slow down completely, just for a while, and imagine a single ordinary day. Not a famous day, Not the day the capstone was set, or the day Khufu himself visited the site. Just an ordinary Tuesday, if we can call it that. Somewhere in the 11th year of construction. The sky is still dark when a young man, we'll call him Senu, though we don't know his real name, only that men very much like him existed by the thousands, wakes on a woven mat inside a small mud brick room in the workers' village. Outside the air is cool, the way desert air always is just before dawn, before the sun climbs high enough to remember its full strength. Senu eats bread from the previous day, still soft, torn by hand, along with a cup of thick, mildly fermented beer, poured from a shared clay jar. His household group collects each morning from the village bakery. He walks with several neighbors toward the quarry, a short distance from the village, joining a slow, growing stream of other workers doing exactly the same thing, all moving in roughly the same direction, murmuring quietly to each other in the grey, pre-dawn light. At the quarry, his overseer, a man perhaps 10 years older, who has worked this same section of stone for several seasons already, assigns the day's task. Today, Senu's small team will finish separating a block that was partially cut the day before. The wedges are already in place from yesterday's work, driven into a groove cut carefully around the block's outline. Water is poured over the wedges, just as it was the evening before, and the team steps back to let it work. While the wood slowly absorbs the water and begins to swell, Senu and his teammates move to a neighboring block, continuing the slow, repetitive work of chiseling a fresh groove. Copper chisel, wooden mallet, copper chisel, wooden mallet, a rhythm so familiar to his hands by now that his mind can wander freely while his body continues the work almost its own. He thinks perhaps about his family's farmland, waiting for him along the riverbank, currently submerged beneath the Nile's seasonal flood. He thinks about the coming months, when the water will recede, and he'll return to planting rather than quarrying. He thinks perhaps about very little at all, simply the chisel, the stone, the mallet, the next stroke. By midday, the heat has become considerable and work slows, though it doesn't stop entirely. Workers rotate through short rest periods in whatever shade is available. Awnings made of woven reeds, or simply the shadow cast by a large uncut block. Bread and dried fish arrive from the village, distributed among the teams by younger workers, whose job for this season is simply logistics, carrying food and water steadily between the village and the quarry, back and forth all day, every day. By afternoon, the wedges have done their work, and yesterday's block separates cleanly from the bedrock with a low, satisfying crack, followed by a brief cheer from Senu's team. A small, private celebration, largely unnoticed by anyone outside their immediate group, but meaningful within it. The block is roughly shaped, then levered onto a waiting sledge. Senu's part in the block's larger journey ends here for today. Other teams, haulers rather than quarry workers, will take over from this point, dragging the sledge toward the river's edge, wetting the sand ahead of its path, chanting together as they pull. Senu won't see this particular block reach its final resting place within the pyramid. He may never know exactly where, within that enormous structure, this single stone eventually settles, and it likely wouldn't have mattered much to him. His task was this block, on this day, cut cleanly and handed off to the next team. Tomorrow, there will be another block and another day, very much like this one. As evening falls, Senu walks back toward the village alongside his neighbors, tired in the particular way that comes from steady physical work rather than sudden strain. The good kind of tired, if there is such a thing. He eats again, talks quietly with people who have become, over these past several seasons, something like a second family. He sleeps, and in the morning, it begins again. This is what the Great Pyramid actually is, if you strip away the scale and the legend and the 4,500 years of accumulated myth. It is thousands of days like this one, thousands of workers like Senu, each one small, each one largely unremarkable on its own, each one quietly necessary. Rest for a moment in that thought. Nothing about any single day was extraordinary, and yet, together, stretched across 20 years, those ordinary days built something that has outlasted every other structure of its era. The Great Pyramid didn't rise alone. Over the following decades, after Khufu's structure was completed, his successors continued building on the same plateau, adding to what would eventually become one of the most concentrated collections of monumental architecture anywhere in the ancient world. Khufu's son, Khafre, built the second pyramid at Giza, slightly smaller than his father's, though positioned on marginally higher ground, giving it the visual illusion, from certain angles, of standing even taller than the Great Pyramid society. Khafre's pyramid still retains a small portion of its original smooth casing near its peak, a rare surviving glimpse of what the entire surface of both pyramids would once have looked like, gleaming and complete. Later, Khafre's own son Menkaure built a third considerably smaller pyramid nearby, completing the trio of monuments that together form the skyline most people picture when they imagine ancient Egypt. Smaller pyramids, built for queens and other close relatives, cluster around these three larger structures, along with an extensive network of mastaba tombs, flat-roofed, rectangular structures built for high officials, arranged in careful, orderly rows, almost like a planned neighborhood for the honored dead. And then, of course, there is the Sphinx. Most Egyptologists believe the Great Sphinx was carved during Khafre's reign from a single, massive outcrop of natural limestone bedrock that happened to sit near his pyramid's causeway, rather than being built up from separately quarried blocks, the way the pyramids were. Instead, workers carved downward and inward, removing stone rather than adding it, revealing the enormous seated figure that had, in some sense, always been present within that outcrop, waiting to be uncovered. The Sphinx combines a lion's body with a human face likely modeled on Khafre himself, gazing eastward, directly toward the rising sun, morning after morning for thousands of years. Sand has partially buried the Sphinx many times throughout its long history, its body disappearing beneath drifting dunes for centuries at a stretch, only to be excavated again by later rulers determined to honor or simply understand this strange and ancient guardian. There is something worth sitting with quietly in the fact that these structures, the three pyramids, the Sphinx, the smaller tombs surrounding them, were not built all at once by a single generation, but accumulated slowly across roughly a century, each pharaoh adding to a landscape that had already, by the time they inherited it, existed for longer than most modern buildings will ever stand. Imagine growing up in the shadow of the Great Pyramid, already ancient and awe-inspiring, even to Khafre and Menkaure, who nonetheless built their own monuments beside it, adding their own quiet chapters to a story that had already begun before they were born. Everything about this project, in the end, moved to the rhythm of the Nile. It's worth sitting with that rhythm for a while, slowly, because almost nothing in this story makes sense without understanding it. Each year, Egyptian life moved through 3 broad seasons, dictated entirely by the river's natural cycle, long before anyone thought to build a pyramid at all. The first season, called Akhet, arrived with the annual flood. Beginning in summer, the Nile would rise, spilling gently across the surrounding farmland, depositing a fresh layer of dark, mineral-rich silt across the fields. The same fertile silt that had made Egyptian agriculture reliable enough for centuries to eventually support a project as enormous as the Great Pyramid. During Akhet, farming was simply impossible. Fields sat submerged, sometimes for weeks at a stretch, waiting patiently for the water to recede. And it was precisely during this season when farmers would otherwise have had nothing to do that pyramid construction absorbed much of the available workforce. The seasonal labor system we discussed earlier, converting temporarily idle farmers into a skilled, motivated construction workforce fed and housed for the duration of the flood season. It was also during Akhet that river transport reached its easiest, most efficient point, with water levels high enough to carry heavily loaded barges much closer to construction sites than during the rest of the year, which is precisely why so much of the heaviest stone transport, including the granite journey we just followed from Aswan, was carefully timed to take advantage of this seasonal window. The second season, Pharaoh, began once the floodwaters receded, leaving behind fresh, fertile soil ready for planting. Farmers returned to their fields during Pharaoh, planting wheat, barley, flax, and other staple crops, while pyramid construction likely continued at a somewhat reduced pace, relying on a smaller, more specialized core workforce, skilled quarrymen, masons, and administrators, rather than the large seasonal labor force available during the flood. The third season, Shemu, brought the harvest, followed by a dry, hot period before the cycle began again with the following year's flood. This rhythm repeated reliably year after year for the entire 20 years of the pyramid's construction, and indeed for centuries before and after it. There's something worth resting in when you consider how deeply this project was woven into a much older, much larger natural cycle. The pyramid wasn't built despite the rhythms of the river and the seasons. It was built because of them, timed carefully around flooding and farming, labor and rest, in a pattern the Egyptians had already understood and relied upon for generations before Khufu ever inherited his throne. 20 years repeating this same 3-part cycle roughly 20 times over. Flood, plant, harvest. Flood, plant, harvest. Each cycle bringing the pyramid a little closer to completion. The way each night's sleep brings you a little closer to whatever rest you're seeking right now. 4,500 years is a difficult length of time to properly picture. So let's slow down once more and consider just a few of the things the Great Pyramid has quietly witnessed, standing in place the entire time. It was already over 2,000 years old when the pharaoh Tutankhamun was born, meaning ancient Egyptians living during Tutankhamun's own famous reign looked upon the pyramid the way we might look upon structures built well before recorded history, structures whose original builders felt as distant and legendary to them as they now feel to us. It was already ancient when Alexander the Great visited Egypt, and ancient still when Roman legions later marched past it. and Julius Caesar is said to have gazed upon it during his time in Egypt. It watched the rise and eventual decline of the Roman Empire, an empire that itself now feels impossibly distant to us. It stood through the spread of Christianity and later the spread of Islam through the region. It stood through the Crusades, through the Black Death, through the invention of the printing press, through the entire European Renaissance, through the voyages of early explorers mapping continents the ancient Egyptians never knew existed. It stood through the Industrial Revolution, through 2 world wars, through the invention of flight, through humanity's first steps onto the surface of the moon. A journey that, remarkably, covered a distance easier for modern engineers to calculate precisely than the exact methods used to build the very pyramid those same engineers were studying. Through every single one of these centuries, the pyramid required almost nothing. No maintenance crews, no structural repairs, beyond what natural weathering and a small number of earthquakes required. No ongoing intervention of any kind. It simply sat patiently, exactly where it was built, doing precisely what its original engineers designed it to do. Endure. There is a kind of profound stillness in that. Everything else in this story changed constantly. Empires, languages, religions, entire ways of understanding the world. The pyramid alone remained essentially the same stone structure, quietly present through all of it, a fixed point around which nearly everything else in human history continued to shift and change. It's worth slowing down for a moment to consider the actual tools involved in all of this, because the simplicity of the toolkit makes the achievement, if anything, even more remarkable. Egyptian workers of this period had no iron. Iron working wouldn't become widespread in Egypt for well over 1,000 years after the pyramid's completion. What they had instead was copper, soft, workable, but far less durable than the harder metals later civilizations would rely on. Copper chisels, copper saws, copper drills, tipped occasionally with harder abrasive materials like quartz sand to help them cut through stone more effectively. Because copper is so soft, tools dulled quickly and quickly became a kind of resource all their own, melted down, reshaped, and resharpened again and again by teams of dedicated metalworkers stationed near the quarries. Some estimates suggest that keeping the quarry workers supplied with usable copper tools may have required almost as much organized industry as the stones cutting itself. Mining copper ore, smelting it in simple clay furnaces, casting new tool heads, and distributing them continuously to hundreds of individual work teams. Alongside copper tools, workers relied heavily on simpler technologies that required no metal at all. Stone hammers, hard, rounded stones, often made of dolerite, used to pound and shape softer limestone through repeated controlled impact rather than cutting. Wooden mallets, wedges, and levers, shaped from acacia and other locally available woods, used constantly throughout every stage of the process, from initial quarrying to final positioning. Rope, made from plant fibers, particularly a reed-like plant called hafa grass, twisted and braided into cords of remarkable strength, strong enough, as we've discussed, to drag multi-ton stones across sand and up-ramps for miles at a time. Surveying tools remained equally simple. The plumb line, a weight on a string, used to verify vertical alignment. The set square, a simple wooden right angle used to check corners. And the maquette, a basic astronomical sighting tool used to track star positions during the nighttime surveys we discussed earlier. No gears, no pulleys in the modern mechanical sense, though some evidence suggests simple rocker devices may have assisted with certain lifting tasks. No wheels, for the reasons we've already covered. Just wood, stone, copper, rope, water, and an enormous amount of carefully organized human effort, repeated with such consistency and precision that the results still stand today, largely unchanged, while far more recently built structures have long since crumbled. There's something worth resting on in that thought. We often assume that greater technology produces greater achievement. And in many ways, of course, it does. But the pyramid stands as a quiet reminder that patience, organization, and consistency, applied over enough time, can accomplish things that seem to require far more advanced tools than were actually available. We touched earlier on the bakeries and breweries that fed the workers, but it's worth slowing down further to appreciate just how large an undertaking this feeding operation truly was, running quietly alongside the more famous work of quarrying and hauling stone. 20 to 30,000 workers present at any given time required an enormous, continuous flow of food, arriving daily from farms scattered up and down the Nile River Valley. Grain arrived by boat in large quantities, harvested from fields that stretched for hundreds of miles along the riverbanks, transported by the same river system used to move granite blocks from Aswan. At the workers' village, enormous bakeries processed this grain into bread on an almost industrial scale. Archaeologists have uncovered large, cone-shaped clay pots called betjar, used specifically for baking bread in bulk. Some sites containing dozens of these pots arranged together, suggesting entire buildings dedicated purely to bread production, running continuously. Nearby, similarly scaled breweries converted grain into a thick, nutritious beer. Not the beer we might picture today, but a calorie-dense, mildly alcoholic staple, safer to drink than untreated river water and considered as much a food source as a beverage. Cattle, sheep, and goats were also raised and slaughtered specifically to supply the workforce with meat. Bone deposits found near the workers' village suggest thousands of cattle were processed over the course of construction. Evidence of a food supply chain sophisticated enough to consistently provide protein to tens of thousands of laborers, season after season, for 2 full decades. Dried and salted fish caught from the Nile itself added further variety and nutrition, requiring their own preservation and storage systems to prevent spoilage in the desert heat. Managing all of this, the farming, the harvesting, the river transport, the baking, the brewing, the butchering, the daily distribution to work teams scattered across the plateau, required its own extensive administrative structure, entirely separate from, but equally essential to, the structural engineering happening at the pyramid itself. Scribes recorded deliveries, tracked rations, and monitored supplies using some of the earliest known administrative writing systems in human history. In fact, some of the very oldest papyrus documents ever discovered, found in caves near the Red Sea coast in 2013, belonging to an official named Mera, describe in exact daily detail the logistics of transporting limestone from Tura to Giza during Khufu's reign. These are, in a very real sense, ancient logistics reports, daily journal entries describing boat trips, cargo loads, and work assignments written by a real person whose job was startlingly similar to a modern shipping coordinator. Imagine that slowly for a moment. 4,500 years ago, Someone sat down at the end of a long day and wrote a simple, practical account of exactly which boats moved exactly which stones, on exactly which day. Ordinary paperwork from an extraordinary project, quietly surviving across a length of time few other documents have ever managed to survive. Even after nearly 2 centuries of dedicated archaeological study, the Great Pyramid still holds a number of genuine, unresolved mysteries, questions serious historians continue to debate carefully and respectfully, without yet reaching full agreement. We've already discussed the uncertainty around exactly which ramp, design, or combination of designs was used to raise the stones. A question that remains formally unsettled despite considerable progress using modern imaging technology. There are other curiosities worth sitting with too. The pyramid's 4 sides are aligned with true north with an accuracy of just a few hundredths of a degree. A level of precision that some modern researchers still find difficult to fully explain using only the star sighting methods we discussed earlier, though most Egyptologists believe refined versions of that method, applied with enough patience and repetition, can plausibly account for the accuracy achieved. The relationship between the pyramid's dimensions and certain mathematical constants has also drawn considerable attention over the years. The ratio between the pyramid's perimeter and its height, for instance, closely approximates 2 times pi, the mathematical constant used to calculate the circumference of a circle. Some researchers believe this reflects deliberate, sophisticated mathematical knowledge on the part of Egyptian architects. Others argue it may simply be a natural byproduct of the specific method used to measure the pyramid's slope, a practical construction technique that happens to produce this ratio as an incidental result rather than evidence of intentional advanced mathematics. Both explanations remain actively discussed among researchers today, without full consensus. The internal shafts we mentioned earlier, narrow passages extending from the king's and queen's chambers toward the pyramid's exterior, have also invited decades of careful astronomical analysis. Some researchers have proposed that specific shafts align with the position, at the time of construction, of particular stars associated with Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife, including stars within the constellation we now call Orion, and the star Sirius, deeply significant in Egyptian religious tradition. Other researchers remain more cautious, noting that with enough stars in the sky, some alignment can almost always be found if you look for it, and caution against assuming intentional symbolism where simpler explanations may exist. And then, of course, there is the void. In 2017, researchers using muon tomography, a technique that tracks naturally occurring cosmic particles as they pass through solid stone, allowing scientists to effectively see hidden spaces without any physical excavation, detected a previously unknown, large empty space above the Grand Gallery, now generally referred to as the Big Void. Its exact purpose remains entirely unknown. It could be a construction feature related to the ramp systems we discussed earlier. It could be an additional, still undiscovered chamber. It could be something else entirely, currently outside our understanding. As of now, we simply don't know. There is something quietly wonderful in that. After 4,500 years, after centuries of careful study, after some of the most advanced scanning technology available to modern science, the pyramid still holds at least one genuine, unopened secret. Perhaps it always will. And perhaps that's all right. Some structures are meant to be fully understood. Others, it seems, are content to keep a small part of themselves quietly hidden, indefinitely resting undisturbed in the dark. Exactly the way so many of us hope to rest ourselves tonight. Let's slow down once more and imagine a different kind of day. Not a worker's day this time, but a single evening in the life of Hemiunu, the chief architect, perhaps 10 years into the project. The sun has set and the worst of the day's heat has finally begun to fade. Hemiunu sits in a modest, comfortable room near the construction site. Papyrus scrolls spread across a low table in front of him, covered in careful diagrams and calculations. A servant brings a simple meal. Bread beer, a portion of the same dried fish distributed to the workers themselves, since even a man of Hemiunu's rank ate largely the same staples as everyone else on this project, differing mainly in quantity and comfort rather than in kind. Tonight, his attention is on a single, persistent problem: the alignment of a passageway deep within the pyramid's growing mass. A corridor that must, eventually, meet precisely with a chamber being built simultaneously, hundreds of feet away, on the opposite side of the structure. There is no way to check this alignment by simply looking. The stone between the 2 points is already solid, already sealed, already permanent. Instead, Hemiunu relies entirely on calculation, on measurements taken carefully, weeks earlier, before the relevant sections were closed off by subsequent layers of stone, and on his own trust in the surveying methods passed down to him by his predecessors, refined across generations of careful practice. He checks the numbers again and again. Outside, faintly, he can hear the low murmur of the workers' village settling into evening. Voices, the occasional laugh, the sound of someone's family preparing a meal. Hemiunu is, in many ways, carrying an enormous weight on his shoulders tonight, quite literally, in the sense that millions of tons of stone depend, ultimately, on decisions made at a table just like this one, using tools far simpler than the scale of the project might suggest. A single wrong calculation, uncorrected, could mean an entire section of the pyramid needs to be reconsidered. Or worse, could mean a hidden structural flaw discovered only generations later, when it is far too late to correct. But Hemiunu has done this before. He trusts the method. He trusts the patient, careful process that has, so far, produced results accurate to within a few centimeters across distances of hundreds of feet. He rolls the scroll closed, sets it aside, and allows himself, finally, to rest. Tomorrow, the measurements will be checked once more against the physical stone itself by teams working simultaneously from both ends of the passageway, converging slowly toward a single meeting point neither team can yet see. It will hold. It always has. He closes his eyes and lets sounds of the sleeping village carry him toward his own rest. The same way, perhaps, this very story is carrying you now. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over very old places. A stillness that feels different from ordinary silence, as though the space itself has simply grown accustomed to time passing, one century after another, without much urgency. Standing at the base of the Great Pyramid today, visitors often describe exactly this feeling. Not excitement, exactly, though there is certainly some of that. Something closer to a hush, a sense of standing beside something that has already witnessed so much, so patiently, that a single visitor's brief presence barely registers as a passing moment in its much longer memory. If stone could remember, what would this stone recall? It would remember, perhaps, the sound of copper chisels against limestone, repeated for years, echoing gently across the quarry each morning. It would remember the low, rhythmic chanting of hauling teams, pulling sledges slowly across sun-warmed sand. It would remember Hemiunu's careful calculations and the quiet satisfaction of a passageway meeting exactly where it was meant to. It would remember Khufu's original burial and the later unwelcome intrusion of tomb robbers, centuries afterward, searching in the dark for treasures long since removed. It would remember Greek and Roman visitors standing exactly where you might stand today, marveling at a structure already ancient even to them. It would remember medieval builders, centuries later still, carefully removing the smooth outer casing stone by stone, repurposing this same material into mosques and city walls that themselves now stand as historical treasures in their own right. It would remember early archaeologists arriving with new tools and new questions, mapping passageways by torchlight, uncovering the workers' village, finally beginning to understand the human story behind the monument. And it would remember, perhaps, this very moment, a quiet voice telling this story once more to someone lying comfortably in the dark, thousands of miles and thousands of years away from the desert where it all began. The stone doesn't need you to remember any of these details precisely. It has already outlasted every person who has ever tried to fully capture its story in words, and it will likely outlast everyone listening to this one too. There is something deeply restful in that thought, if you let yourself sit with it. You don't need to hold on to anything tonight. You don't need to remember the exact weight of a granite block, or the precise angle of true north, or the name of an architect who lived and worked and rested. Just as you are resting now, over 4,000 years ago, you can simply let it all settle, quietly, the way sand settles at the base of an ancient monument, undisturbed, patient, at peace. We've spent a long time now on how the pyramid was built. Let's slow down for a while and gently consider why. To modern minds, spending 20 years and the labor of tens of thousands of people constructing a single tomb can seem at first difficult to fully understand. But to the Egyptians of Khufu's time, the pyramid wasn't simply a tomb in the way we might picture a modern grave or mausoleum. It was something closer to a machine for the afterlife. A carefully engineered device intended to help the pharaoh's spirit successfully complete its journey into eternity. Egyptian religious belief held that the pharaoh occupied a unique position between the human world and the divine. Upon death, it was believed the pharaoh's spirit needed to ascend, joining the sun god Ra on his eternal journey across the sky. The pyramid's shape itself carried deep symbolic meaning in this context. Some historians believe its sloping sides were meant to evoke the rays of sunlight streaming down from the sun toward the earth, a physical, solid representation of the very pathway the pharaoh's spirit was meant to travel, in reverse, back up toward the heavens. The pyramid's original, brilliant white casing and its reflective, possibly gold-covered capstone would have reinforced this symbolism further, catching sunlight in a way that made the entire structure appear, quite literally, to glow. The narrow shafts extending from the king's and queen's chambers toward the exterior, the ones we discussed earlier, possibly aligned with specific stars, may have been intended as spiritual pathways, guiding the pharaoh's spirit toward its intended destination among the stars. particularly the circumpolar stars that never set below the horizon, viewed by Egyptians as eternal and unchanging, a fitting destination for a spirit seeking permanence. From this perspective, every stone placed, every measurement checked, every year of labor invested carried genuine religious weight, not merely political ambition. Workers weren't simply building a large structure to satisfy one man's ego, as popular imagination sometimes assumes. Many likely understood their labor as directly supporting the pharaoh's successful transition into the afterlife. A role considered vital not just for the pharaoh personally, but for the continued cosmic order and prosperity of Egypt as a whole. The pharaoh, in Egyptian belief, played an essential role in maintaining balance between order and chaos, a concept the Egyptians called ma'at. Ensuring a smooth transition into the afterlife wasn't simply about honoring one individual. It was about preserving that broader cosmic balance for the benefit of everyone living along the Nile. This helps explain, at least in part, why an entire nation might dedicate such enormous resources and effort toward a single structure. It wasn't simply architecture. It was, in its own way, an act of collective religious devotion expressed through stone, labor, and time. Whether or not you share these particular beliefs yourself, there's something worth appreciating in the depth of meaning the builders themselves brought to this work. They weren't simply moving rocks. They believed, quite genuinely, that they were helping guide someone toward eternity. That belief, real and sincerely held, may explain a great deal about how 20 years of extraordinarily demanding labor was sustained, season after season, without the structure of coercion popular legend once assumed was necessary. Purpose, it turns out, can move almost as much weight as rope and water-dampened sand. For many centuries after ancient Egyptian civilization itself faded, the pyramids remained visible, but increasingly misunderstood by the various cultures that came to occupy the land around them. Medieval Arab scholars wrote extensively about the pyramids, some proposing detailed, thoughtful theories about their construction, others attributing them to legendary kings from before a great flood, blending historical curiosity with folklore in ways common to many cultures encountering monuments from a much older, poorly documented past. European travelers during the medieval and early modern periods wrote home with astonished descriptions, though often mixed with considerable inaccuracy, since serious archaeological study of Egypt hadn't yet begun in any organized way. Genuine systematic study began to accelerate in 1798, when Napoleon Bonaparte's military campaign in Egypt brought along a large team of scholars, scientists, and artists specifically tasked with documenting the country's ancient monuments in careful, methodical detail. Their work, eventually published as an enormous multi-volume set called the Description de l'Égypte, introduced European audiences to detailed, accurate depictions of the pyramids for the first time, sparking a wave of scholarly and public fascination that has never entirely faded since. The following century brought increasingly careful archaeological investigation. In 1837, British engineer Howard Vyse used gunpowder to force his way into the previously sealed relieving chambers above the king's chamber, discovering the quarry markings and worker gang names we discussed earlier. Rough, painted inscriptions never intended for anyone to see, hidden for thousands of years until his forceful, if somewhat unconventional, Methods brought them back into the light. Later, archaeologists worked with considerably more care and precision. Flinders Petrie, working in the 1880s, conducted remarkably accurate surveys of the pyramid's dimensions, using careful, methodical measurement techniques that confirmed, for the first time, with genuine scientific rigor, just how extraordinarily precise the original construction truly was. More recent decades have brought entirely new tools to this ancient puzzle. Ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging capable of detecting subtle temperature differences that hint at hidden chambers, and the muon tomography scanning we discussed earlier, capable of revealing large internal voids without any physical excavation at all. Each new generation of researchers has approached the pyramid with new tools, new questions, and often new humility. The more carefully we study it, the more clearly we recognize just how sophisticated its original builders truly were, working with nothing but rope, wood, copper, water, and an extraordinary, patient understanding of stone. It's a strange kind of conversation, in a sense, one that has now stretched across nearly 2 centuries of serious study and shows no sign of concluding anytime soon. Each generation asks its questions. The pyramid answers some of them, slowly and quietly keeps the rest to itself. Of all the great wonders listed by ancient Greek writers, the Colossus of Rhodes, the Lighthouse of Alexandria, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the statue of Zeus at Olympia, only one still stands today, largely intact, roughly as it was originally built. The Great Pyramid is, quite simply, the last surviving member of the ancient world's original 7 wonders. Every other entry on that ancient list has fallen, toppled by earthquakes, dismantled for building material, lost to fires, or simply worn away by time until nothing recognizable remained. Only the pyramid endured. This singular survival has, understandably, made it a subject of endless fascination, curiosity, and occasionally wild speculation across the many centuries since. In more recent times, some writers have proposed elaborate theories suggesting the pyramid must have been built with assistance from advanced, lost civilizations, or even visitors from beyond our own planet, unable to accept that Bronze Age human beings, working with copper tools and rope, could have accomplished something so precise and enduring. The archaeological evidence, gathered patiently across nearly 2 centuries of careful study, tells a different story, a far more human one, and, in many ways, a far more remarkable one. It tells the story of ordinary farmers, temporarily reorganized into a skilled, motivated workforce. It tells the story of architects who inherited generations of hard-won engineering knowledge and carefully. It tells the story of a supply chain sophisticated enough to feed tens of thousands of people daily for 20 consecutive years, using nothing but bread ovens and careful record-keeping. It tells the story, in other words, of exactly what people are capable of when given enough time, enough purpose, and enough willingness to cooperate towards something larger than any single lifetime. No lost civilization required, no visitors from beyond the stars, just people, remarkably similar to the people building things all around you today, whether that's a house down the street, a bridge across a river, or a small garden wall in someone's backyard, applying patience and cooperation on a scale large enough to outlast every empire that would ever try to claim it as its own. The pyramid remains today one of the most visited historical sites on Earth, drawing millions of travelers each year from every corner of the globe, each one standing for a brief moment in the same quiet shadow that has fallen across this same patch of desert for 4,500 years. Most of those visitors stay only a few hours. Some barely look up from their cameras before moving on to the next stop on a busy itinerary. But the pyramid doesn't mind. It has never needed anyone's attention to continue existing quietly, exactly as it is. It was built, in the end, not for us. It was built for eternity, by people who genuinely believed in eternity and who worked patiently, stone by stone, as though they had all the time in the world to get it right. In a strange, quiet way, they did. And so, slowly, very slowly, our pyramid is complete. Every stone quarried, every measurement checked and checked again. Every passageway aligned exactly as it needed to be. Every casing stone polished until the entire structure gleamed white against a desert sky that has since watched over it for 4,500 years. If you're still awake, that's all right. There's no need to follow the story any further tonight. There's nothing left to build, nothing left to carry, nothing left to measure or quarry or haul across the sand. Just let it rest now, the way the pyramid has learned to rest, patiently, for longer than almost anything else made by human hands. Somewhere, right now, far across an ocean, or perhaps just a short distance from wherever you are lying comfortably tonight, the Great Pyramid is standing quietly in the dark. Sand shifting gently at its base, the way it always has, grain by grain settling a little more with each passing year. Stars turning slowly overhead, the same stars once used to find true north. The same stars that may once have guided narrow shafts through solid granite toward a destination we can still only partly understand. Somewhere below, deep within that solid mass of stone, in a chamber built with such extraordinary care that it has never once cracked, a plain granite sarcophagus sits in silence, exactly where careful hands set it down so many centuries ago. Somewhere nearby, the Great Sphinx continues its long, patient watch toward the eastern horizon, exactly as it has since Khafre's workers first uncovered its shape from the bedrock, waiting, as it always has and always will, for the sun to rise again tomorrow morning. Nothing to build tonight, nothing to carry, nothing to measure. Just stillness, just stone. Just time, moving slowly, patiently, the way it always has, over deserts, over rivers, over quiet monuments that have long since stopped counting the years. Let your breathing slow, the way the river once slowed each year before rising again. Let your body rest, the way stone rests, heavy and settled and unhurried. Let your thoughts drift quietly away, the way sand drifts slowly across an ancient plateau, grain by grain, with nowhere urgent left to be. Rest now. This has been Sleepy Construction. Good night.